Hello and welcome to the History with Hilbert podcast. Now, if you're a familiar viewer on the channel, you'll note that this is a bit of a different style of video to the one I normally do. And if you want to sort of skip ahead of the preamble of me explaining what this is, then I'll leave a timestamp in the description so that you can just go straight to the part where I'm talking about the Norse and the Sámi. But anyway, it's a bit of a different style of video because I often have an awful lot of video topics I want to make, but only a limited amount of time in which to do it. And a large part of the time that I spend on the videos goes on making the visual aspect, which I really enjoy doing, don't get me wrong, but I also just want to sometimes sit down and talk about a topic at length, at a greater length. And this is something that a lot of people in the comments have said, you know, Hilbert, we want you to go in depth, we want you to go down all the rabbit holes, all the tangents. But unfortunately, that's not possible in a video because I've got to link what's on the screen with what I'm saying and with timings and all this kind of thing. But I thought maybe that's why it would be a good idea to start a sort of podcast. Now, perhaps people aren't looking for this kind of thing. Perhaps you want the shorter, snappier videos on maybe more interesting or stranger topics like why Mongolia is changing its language or how a certain flag has evolved or something along those lines, and that's completely fine. Please let me know in the comment section. Just be as honest as you can be, and I'll see how many people are enjoying this kind of content and who wants me to focus more on the other kind of videos. But I thought it might be nice to sort of sit down, not to focus so much on the visual part of a video or of making it snappy and particularly interesting. I mean, I hope this is going to be interesting as well, but to talk in a more long form way about a topic, to go into depth a little bit more. Having said that, I would like to put timestamps in the description so that if you're interested in a particular aspect of, in this case, the Norse interaction with the Sámi, then you can just go straight into the description, find it there, and watch that bit. But yeah, let me know what you think of this new form. If you've got any other ideas for kind of podcasts you'd like to see in the future. Now, these will mostly be on the Viking Age or the Anglo-Saxons, or to do with language, because of course it's got to be an area that I'm very familiar in, that I can just talk about for a while. So unfortunately that's not every area of history. I'm quite limited in what I know about for such a long form discussion type. But anyway, this is basically the end of the preamble. What I want to talk about today is the interaction between the Sámi and the Norse, how the two cultures viewed each other, and how integrated their two societies were with one another. Because we tend to think of the Viking Age as an era of great connection. That's one lens with which to view the period. You've got Scandinavians that are going eastwards, so they're connecting to places in the Baltic. They're sailing down these eastern rivers like the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, etc., and they're ending up in the Black Sea. They're trading with the Arabs. That's why we find an awful lot of Arabic dirhams that are being buried. They're trading with Byzantium, but at the same time, this system is linked westwards with the North Sea. I recently made a video on the Vikings in Frisia. Of course, the Vikings were a huge factor in England, in Ireland, in Scotland, in Francia. They go around the Mediterranean. They're trading in North Africa. They're going across the North Sea, not the North Sea, the North Atlantic. They're discovering new continents, and they're linking an awful lot of people together. This is also when we see towns springing up in Ireland. There were no towns there beforehand, and they changed the method in which urbanism was manifested in England as well. If you look at the difference between Anglo-Saxon York or Eoforwich with Jorvik, there's a huge difference there. So they're clearly linking people together in a way that hadn't been done since the Roman period. And then, of course, Scandinavia had never been part of that connected network. But what we don't tend to think about so much is how they interacted with their close neighbours to the north, the Sámi. Because the Sámi are semi-nomadic, sometimes completely nomadic people that spoke a completely different language from the Vikings at the time, or the Norse at the time. Because, well, of course, the Scandinavian languages, just like English, are Indo-European languages. So that's a huge belt of languages that connects most of Europe and going into areas like Iran and the Middle East, that's non-Arabic speaking at least, and into parts of India too. They're all Indo-European languages. But the Sámi, they're speaking a Finno-Ugric language. This is from a completely different branch of language family, and it's completely different if you hear it. So first of all, I thought I'd take a look at some of the textual sources that we have that describe the relationship between the two, and then to bring in some archaeology, some DNA, some linguistic features, and other inferences that can be drawn. Now, we're very lucky in this case because we have quite an early source that talks about this, and this is actually a source that's not written in Old Norse, as you might expect, but it's written in Old English, because this was a source that was described from a journey of a Norse trader called Ottar in Old Norse, but in Old English this has become Ochtara, so often this is called the Voyage of Ochtara, and it's actually recorded in a manuscript that's a translation of the Latin work by Orosius called the Seven Histories against the Pagans, and this was written at the end of the 9th century at the court of King Alfred, and it basically describes this conversation that was had about this Norse trader describing his life and his journey to King Alfred. Now, it's very interesting because Ottar describes how he is from Hålogaland, and this is in the very north of Norway. And he says that he lives the furthest north of all the Norse, so it might be possible to, from this, base a kind of dividing line of, there was this idea that the Norse live here, and to the north it's the Sámi. And actually, if we look, archaeologically speaking, you can draw a sort of border in the material culture from the Viking Age at the Lyngen Fjord. And to the south of this is the northerlymost point where we find Norse longhouses being built, whereas to the north you find these semicircular kind of houses and the material culture that's associated with the Sámi a lot more. So it's possible this was a borderline, but as I said, you can locate the Sámi further south the further back you go in history. And actually, through studying the place names, it might be possible to find the Sámi living much further south than they do today in the more central regions of Norway and of Sweden. Perhaps they even lived as far south as the area of Viken, which is, it has a coast with the Kattegat. So that'll be very interesting if that's the case. But in this period, they seem to have moved slightly further north, although I'll be talking about how this kind of border wasn't quite as rigid, and there was quite a lot of movement between the border and movement in the cultures as well. Now, another thing that Ochtara mentions is that there was a lot of trade between the two, and he actually mentions journeys of going north and of trading with the Sámi, as well as a little bit of conflict between them. And this is again repeated because he also mentions that the Norse would go and they would collect tribute from the Sámi. And this isn't, like, we shouldn't be imagining people going and collecting taxes, because of course the Sámi in the north, they aren't part of the coin economy. And in fact, at the time, neither were the Scandinavians. They were very much part of a bullion economy at this point. No Scandinavian kings in the 9th century were yet minting coinage on any kind of large scale. But what they were taxing actually was pelts, was furs, because the Sámi, they lived in the north, and they appear to have become a very prominent player in the fur trade. And this would only increase as the Middle Ages wore on, because royal courts wanted the best kind of furs to line coats, gloves, all this kind of thing. It was a very much prestige item. And in the north, you have obviously animals like fox, like pine marten, otters, beaver, that kind of thing. They all provided great coats. Especially prized were the winter coats that the animal gets in the winter, so it can blend in with the snow ground. And so, of course, the best place to get that is in a place where the snow is all year round. So the Sámi had access to that, as well as to the lower climes where you could get different types of furs. But this is the kind of tribute that Ochtara is speaking about. We also have more evidence to corroborate this from the Viking Age in Egil's saga, which is Egil's saga, Egil Skallagrimsson. Who is a very famous Viking figure. He's around in the 10th century, but the saga is written later. I think the saga dates from the 13th or the 14th century in Iceland, but it's definitely based on historical events. There are historical characters in it, so we might place it in this historical framework. And in Egil's saga, we hear that Thorolf goes to collect this tribute from the Sámi, but there's quite a big sort of subtext of intimidation, because he goes with 90 men. So if you're going with 90 men, that's probably to ensure that there's no trouble on the way, which might indicate that the Sámi weren't always too pleased about having to pay tribute to the north, which is fair enough. And actually later on, in the slightly later Middle Ages, the Norwegian monarchy had an official term for this, which is called the Finnskatt, which is the Finn tax. The Scot there is related to the word skeat in Old English, which is the kind of coin. It's quite interesting. Or the Dutch word schot, which means treasure. And Finn, I should also explain, is a term that's often used for the Saami. The Finnar is the plural in the Old Norse for the Saami people, who linguistically are related to people from Finland today. That is ultimately that origin, but there is a difference there. But just to be aware that when they're talking about Finnar in Old Norse texts, they're mostly talking about the Saami. There is also a trade between the Norse or the later Norwegian monarchy and the Sámi. A specific trade is again mostly in furs, which is called the Finnkaup. And kaup, again, related to words for buy, words for marketplace, like kaupangen is buying. So that was the name for marketplace. So Finnkaup was the Finn trade that was there. And actually the Norwegian government later on made it illegal for non-royal agents to participate in this trade. So you had to be working for the crown, which again suggests it was a very lucrative trade that was going on between the Sámi and various other people. But as we'll see a bit later on, people didn't really hold to this agreement at all much, which is quite interesting. Now, what's interesting about these sources, and there are a lot of other sources that talk about the Sámi and the Norse and their interactions, but again it does suggest that it's a kind of one-way relationship in many ways. The Norse are getting tribute from the Sámi. The later Norwegian kings are limiting the interaction that they can have with non-Sámi people and trading in their own way. But there are other ways as well that we can look at this relationship that shows a bit more of a picture that isn't as clear cut, that puts them into sort of two camps. But there is a fair bit of interaction and trade that goes on between them outside of this kind of official narrative. So there is also evidence of quite a bit of communication between them, especially in this trading sense. And we can see this by looking at loan words that appear in both Old Norse and the various Sámi languages. Now, the Old Norse word for fox, revr, comes from the Sámi word reban. So it's interesting that we have a word for fox, of course, because this was one of the main pelts that was being traded. The main fur was fox fur, was especially highly prized. And so it's interesting that that word in Old Norse has come from the Sámi. Of course, revr is very different to the word for fox in other Germanic languages. Of course, you have fox, you have foss, and these kinds of words. Now, there's also, it's going the other way. It's not just in Old Norse, but interestingly, the Sámi word for iron, and apologies because I have no idea how Sámi phonology works, but ruovde is similar to the Proto-Germanic, this attested form raudan, which is the ultimate root for the word red, which, I guess you can see rust and iron in that kind of vein. And it's interesting because metal objects are the ones that were most highly prized by the Sámi when they were trading with the Scandinavians and also sometimes Russian merchants in the later Middle Ages, because they didn't have any kind of ironworking technology of their own. And of course, iron is a very useful resource. It's much harder. It's much more resilient than stone in many ways. Its edge can be sharper for cutting, as well as also finding some kind of primitive monetary form that was being used by the Sámi in terms of small bronze chips. So it's interesting that these words, it clearly suggests a trading relationship, because these important words were coming in from the other languages. Another interesting point is that if you look at most of the Sámi that you come across in the Icelandic sagas, and again Jackson Crawford talked more in depth about exactly which sagas they appear in what form. Most of them are recorded as having Norse names, which does suggest a degree of bilingualism in that way. Which, bilingualism, you have to have a fairly close relationship with someone speaking a language to be able to learn that language, especially because this wasn't a literate culture. So bilingualism would come from interaction, and enough interaction that it was worth learning the other language. Now that's if this is actually the case here. They might just have had Old Norse names because the writers in Iceland in the later Middle Ages didn't know the Sámi names, or it was easier to remember an Old Norse name, or their name kind of sounded like an Old Norse name, so they changed it. But it's possible, like you have today with, for example, a lot of Chinese students who move to Western countries, they will take a Western name as well as they're obviously their Chinese name that they're known to as their family and their friends back home. So it's possible this is something that the Saami did, that they had a name and and then I guess with a name also you can have a slightly different identity when you are in the Norse sphere, when they're speaking with people from Scandinavia, when they're trading with them, that they have this Old Norse name, or even marrying and living with them, as I'll touch on in a second. And it's possible that the Borgormale is a kind of language, I believe it means sort of citizen speak, if I'm not mistaken, in the Swedish province of Lappmark. Again, Lapp is another term that's sometimes used for the Sami, like Lapland, although I don't think they like it when you call them that anymore. But this was a language being spoken in the 18th century, and it's a sort of much simplified version of Swedish with aspects of Sami in it. So it's some kind of older pidgin or a creolized hybrid language that might have survived from this period. And again, it's very possible that there were these kinds of hybrid languages that emerged between peoples that were interacting, especially later on when we look at the Birkalar, who were kind of a group in the middle that were allowed to trade with the Sami and interact with them, but were still apart from the Sami, a separate group in the north. Now, the Historia Norvegiae, which is probably a source that was written in Norway, but we have it surviving in an Icelandic manuscript, it describes Sami magic very, very well, to the point where whoever got that information, I mean, it's unlikely to have been the monk, although it might have been who was writing it in Norway. They must have been very familiar with how the Sami did things and how they practiced, because it describes the Sami tradition of the ceremonial beating of a drum by a shaman. And this shamanic tradition is very important to the Sami, and it's also maybe come into the Nordic religion. This is something that was noted by Dubois in his work on the Nordic religions, which I'll put a link to that in the description. This Sami shamanic tradition of beating on the drum, and what actually happens with this is that there are many symbols that are painted on this drum, and there's also kind of a marker on the back, so that when you beat the drum, the marker moves, and basically wherever the marker lands in this ceremony, the symbol will have a certain association, and then the shaman will know what this means and will say to the person who they're doing this ritual for that this symbol has a certain significance for them in this ritual context. But anyway, Dubois noted that the Norse tradition of a similar practice in many ways, Seithur, might actually come from the Sami, because the Norse religion didn't have a real shamanic element to it as we would recognize it, whereas the Sami do. Now, it's also noted that Seithur is often associated with foreigners. Now, not just Sami foreigners, although that is often the case, also sometimes with people from Ireland and other places. But that is interesting, because it might reflect that it comes from a different culture, and that it, and also reflect that there was a certain memory that this might have come in its original form from a practice that was done by the Sami. Now, this, of course, does represent a much higher level of interaction and integration than just coming and taxing them from time to time, because for something to enter a religious practice, that's important. That's something very fundamental to people's lives. So there must have been a great degree at a certain point in time, whether this was earlier when the Sami lived further south in Scandinavia, or whether this came in that we know from the sagas that Norse people highly valued and respected Sami fortune-telling and magic and all of this kind of thing, so much so that Christians were banned from going north and into Sami land, so that they couldn't get these messages from these Sami shamans and things like this. So there was clearly a respect for Sami magic that was found, but also there is a more negative connotation of Seithur. This is something that Jackson Crawford has talked a lot about as well, that it's associated very much with the feminine, and it might be a slightly shameful thing as well. It was thought that this was a woman's kind of magic. So it's a bit of a complex relationship, because you also have, I think it's in Lokasena, which is another Icelandic text, where it mentions that the god Odin, that he practices Seithur, and that he's then insulted by Loki, another god, who says, "You beat on the drum as witches do," which might then be a reflection of a more negative attitude in the Norse tradition of these Sami beliefs of kind of beating the drum and using this magic, if it did come from the Sami tradition, which I think is likely, certainly influenced by it. If not, it's not a carbon copy, but it's certainly influenced by this, which I think is very interesting to look at this interaction between them in the realm of the spiritual and the realm of the ceremonial. So moving away from the textual evidence and what inferences can be drawn from that, there's also a lot of DNA evidence and research that has gone into the Sami, especially trying to figure out where they actually came from and when they came from the places they did. And that's, a whole other topic by itself. But I want to use this as a lens through which to view Norse and Sami relationships and to possibly highlight how the border between the two may have been more fluid than previously imagined. So aDNA, which is ancient DNA, so that's basically when you find a skeleton, if you can get through the bone, then you can extract DNA from that as well. Now, I'm not a huge scientist, so some of the descriptions may be a little bit rudimentary, but I hope that'll get the message across anyway. But so aDNA stands for ancient DNA. So if we do a DNA study today, it'll be from modern people, which has all sorts of problems, like how can you tell they're from the same area? What about this admixture, that admixture? What about later migrations? But aDNA should be a better way to do this. It also has an awful lot of problems, like contamination, for example. But yeah, aDNA from a skeleton that was found at Tuna I Åslike, and I'm hoping that's the right pronunciation because that's a dangerous one, in Sweden, which is a fair bit further south than we'd normally imagine the kind of border to be between the Sami and the Norse. But aDNA from a skeleton there, it's found to have the Y chromosome DNA. So Y chromosome is the one that you get from your father. So this is the DNA on your father's side. It found that the DNA there was typically associated with a Sami haplogroup. So you can see with certain strains of DNA that are associated with certain population groups, and so the Sami DNA is very different to the Norse DNA, so you can tell them apart. But so it suggests that this individual who was buried in this boat burial had a Sami father. But if you look at the mtDNA, which is mitochondrial DNA, that comes through your mother's side of the line, then it suggests that the mother did have Norse ancestry, as we would imagine it. So it's interesting that you can sort of find evidence for marriages that are going on, and this is also reflected in the sagas that talk about marriages at the elite level of society in any case. And if it's a boat burial, it's likely this individual was of a higher up in the hierarchy, not just some schlub from off a farm. So that's interesting. That's evidence of a relationship between a Sami person, a Sami man, and a Norse woman. But what's actually potentially even more interesting, or which adds to this picture, is the remains of an adult female that was discovered in 1942 at Velvestad in Norway. And this the grave had been classified as being Norse, which was based on the surrounding artifacts within the burial context, because often we can, if you have a boat burial, that's likely going to be a Norse person being buried there, because we know that they buried people in this way. Now, the Sami, they buried people in a very different way. They either cremated people, which the Norse do as well, but they either cremated them or they buried them in a kind of ditch with scree in it, or birch bark pits. So it's quite different from a boat burial. So it was assumed that the person buried here, especially because there was an axe being buried next to it, which you sometimes find, as well as the fact that it was within a burial mound, that suggests this is a Norse person. But actually, a DNA study by Gennett et al. In 2004 found that the extraction of the mitochondrial DNA, which again is from the mother's side, that it didn't show to be Norse at all, but was actually the Sami strain, which is a strain that's really commonly found in genetically Sami individuals. So the fact that you have someone who is genetically Sami but buried in a very Norse way opens up a lot of possibilities and questions about how people viewed their identity and burial practices, and how this wasn't necessarily completely 100% linked to their genetic heritage, because this person likely was born a Sami. We of course don't know the details, but we also don't know how people viewed themselves. Archaeology can tell us a lot, but we don't know how people thought of themselves, viewed themselves during this period, and this can only really give us clues. Now, it's possible that this individual had married into Norse society, and that's why she was buried according to its customs. This is something that we see in Heimskringla, which is the stories about the Norse kings written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century in Iceland. Because it mentions again at the highest elite strata that there were marriages between the two. So Norway's first king, often seen as the unifier of Norway, Harald Fairhair, he married a Sami woman, Snefridr, which again, Snefridr is of course a Norse name, not a Sami name, but we know that she was a Sami, and also that there was then some kind of advantage for Norwegian kings to marry the Sami, because of course marriages were incredibly political back then. He had a lot of enemies. He potentially united some of the petty kingdoms in some way, either in Western Norway. Traditionally he's seen as uniting them all in Norway, but that's quite unlikely. But that's very interesting that might be what's being seen here in this grave with the aDNA that was extracted, and looking at the actual archaeological context. This was a Sami woman within a Norse context being buried in a Norse way rather than a Sami way, as one might expect. Now, to move on to a very different kind of archaeology, is to look at what have been called the multi-room stone houses, and these are found in northern Finnmark. So this is part of Norway. It's the very north. It's bordering onto the ocean up there, and these are stone houses that are normally dated from around 1200 to 1500. So we've left the Viking Age at this point, although it is a very interesting case study into interaction between the Sami and other peoples. And again, it's relating to some of the sources actually that talk about the Sami. Now, they're often found in the western part, between straits, between the islands that are up there and the mainland of Norway. And so it's suggested that it had some kind of connection to seaborne travellers, because obviously if you're travelling there, you want it to stay closer to the coast because you can avoid the storms and you can make landfall if you need. So by having it between an island, you've got shelter, you've got a bay kind of area there, and then also the mainland. It suggests that it was being used by people travelling by sea. So most of the sources that talk about the Sami describe them as being semi-nomadic, and a lot of the time it revolved around the hunting and actually later on herding of reindeer. They were Sami hunters before they were Sami herders. In Ágrip of Noregs Konungasögum, we also find records of the existence of a people called the Bu-Finnar. Now, Finnar, as I already explained, is the Norse term for Sami. Bu is the settled, so the settlement Sami, which is interesting because this might be referring to inhabitants of these kinds of multi-room houses that were made of stone, because this is really different from what we see in the Sami tradition. They tended to build semicircular houses that could be broken up easily and moved around, so it's really different to what came before. So possibly that's relating to these stone houses. We also have the presence of Orthodox crucifixes in burials in the very far north, because we need to remember as well that while at this point they were interacting with the Scandinavians to the south, you also have the other connection, because they live right across the top of Scandinavia and into the Kola Peninsula, which is it's Finland and Russia now. I think traditionally it was in Finland, so it borders right onto Russia. So actually traders from Novgorod, which had been founded by the Norse, of course, who went east, they also came to the very far north, and there was a bit of a struggle between the Norwegian kings and the kings of Novgorod about who could tax the Sami and who could trade with them, and there's evidence for conflict between the two there as well. But that's why we find Orthodox crosses from the 14th century, so it's possible that these stone houses were being built by these traders in that way. Although actually in the 2003 study by Amundsen and Henriksen, they posited the fact that there could be several explanations for this, though there didn't have to be one explanation, because before their study everyone had kind of said, someone had argued for Norwegians, another person had argued for Russians coming and doing it, another person had argued this is a separate strain of the Sami. But actually they based their argument on something really different, which is very interesting, because the Sami, the buildings that are found there, the multi-room buildings, are slightly similar to ones that you find in Iceland. And actually in the Icelandic Royal Chronicle, Morkinskinner, you find that the Icelanders are often described as coming and trading with the Sami, which is happening despite this ban that the Norwegian king had put on it, this monopoly that the agents of the king had. And actually, we can find even more evidence of this illegal trade from the 13th and 14th century by looking at customs registers from the English coastal towns at the time. So we might be thinking of perhaps Ipswich, London, places like this, maybe York, that they have an awful lot of hides coming in: squirrel, brown bear, beaver, otter, and moose. These are all animals that must have been coming from the area where the Sami were living. So highly likely they were being traded with the Sami, which was illegal. So we have to wonder who were the middlemen in this trade. Quite possibly, of course, Norwegians as well. But Icelanders were coming to this far northern point. Of course, for them, it would be a dash across the what's called the Norwegian Sea, the sea strait between Iceland and the very north of Scandinavia. And this was happening without the permission or consent, or perhaps with the knowledge, and just the Norwegian king didn't do anything about it. But it's interesting, there's this connection then with Icelanders as well as with people from Norway and Sweden further south. What's very interesting is that in 1310, when the Norwegian king wants to engage in the Finnkalp, so the trading with the Sami that was being done, he actually gave that job to an Icelander, to Gissur Gatle. And that maybe indicates that Icelanders were very familiar with this northern territory due to these generations of illegal trading that had gone on. But anyway, to go back to the study of Amundsen and Henriksen, they posited that actually they might have been built, these stone houses, by trading Icelanders. Well, because again, it's close to the sea lanes. We know Icelanders were coming up there and trading with the Sami, similar to Icelandic houses. But what's very interesting is that we find Sami artifacts at these houses, so pieces of cut bronze that might have formed a sort of primitive coinage for the people there, as well as tooth amulets, which we know the Sami wore, and some still do, and we can see it in photographs from the 19th century and 20th century, as well as in archaeological contexts from similar periods. So it suggests to some kind of Sami habitation of these houses in some way. They basically concluded in their study that the houses were probably built by the Icelanders, because we don't have this kind of tradition among the Sami of building houses from stone, or particularly not in this form, that they were built by the Icelanders, but then they interacted and perhaps cohabited with Sami people, and that these were places to come together on a seasonal basis for trade, which explains also the eastern artifacts, because it's possible the Sami traded those with the Novgorodians in the east, and then they came west, and so that linked Iceland with the markets to the east through the Sami. So they're actually playing the role of middlemen trading in the far north, which is a very different and interesting angle to take when looking at these interactions. It's also true that in other ways, the Norse and other cultures the Sami interacted with changed their culture, and perhaps in an incredibly fundamental way. Now, when we tend to think of Sami today, or Lapland, we think of huge reindeer herds. The Sami are the reindeer herders of the world. But actually, this wasn't always the case, and it's thought that initially they were reindeer hunters rather than reindeer herders, but that their way of life changed, possibly as a result of being drawn into these trading networks with people like the Norse and later the Russians as well. And actually, in a 2015 study, I'll put all the studies in the description below, by the way, by Sámi et al., they found that actually you get more reindeer remains in sacrificial sites, sacrificial Sami sites, that they start to appear a lot more at kind of the 9th century, the 10th century moving forward, rather than the larger variety of wild animals like bears were particularly highly valued by the Sami in these sacrificial sites. And so by looking at the chronology and the amount of different animal species you find buried there, you can tell which ones were becoming more important for the Sami, because they'd be sacrificing the most important animals at these sites. And actually reindeer evidence of their taming, either for pastoralism, so using them for herding, or for decoys to be used in hunting, because some Norse sources tell us that there were reindeer decoys, which is quite a fun idea when you think about it, but these would probably be tamed reindeer that could be used by Sami hunters to hunt reindeer, which is a very different hunting tradition to the one that the Norse used at the time, who used things like blinders and shakers and rattles to chase them, and then chase them into pits and that kind of thing. But we find evidence for this being used from the 9th century, which suggests that Sami culture was changing at this point, that this tradition of hunting was changing, possibly due to a more market-oriented style of hunting, rather than just the kind of subsistence that hunter-gatherers needed to hunt reindeer for. This was a more monetized economy that they were entering. So the influence of trade massively influenced the Sami way of life. Now, whether this was just trade or also the tribute, because we need to remember that while the Sami might have been getting things like iron and metal and other commodities from the south, the tribute was something that was being imposed on them earlier, probably by chieftains in the area, like is the case with Thorolf and Ochtere, but also later by the more centralized formal administrations of Norway. And what's worse was that a lot of the time the Russian states thought they could tax the Sami as well. So there were whole disputes between Norway and Russia about who had the right to tax where, and later on the Swedes get involved as well. So that's very interesting. And the move from reindeer hunting might have come as a result of local hierarchies starting to develop. So there was more societal stratification. So beforehand, people had been more on the same kind of level, whereas now we might have got some evidence that there's certain Norse in the Icelandic sagas. We get various references to the Finnar Konung, so the king of the Finns, the king of the Sami in that case. Then, but whether this was an actual king, most likely not, but there probably was some kind of stratification. We also see richer burials from this period. So it's quite possible that this was as a result of these hierarchies developing, because they needed to distribute resources differently to hunt wild reindeer, and then to move towards this kind of herding system because of the economic pressures by globalizing trade connections. If they were more invested in trade systems going over to England and Iceland and Russia, as well as the taxation. And also we see the change from communal hunting and communal herding to private ownership of reindeer, and the notion of one, and I have no idea how this is pronounced, but Saida, in the Sami language, which is a familial group actually owning the land, which wasn't a concept that they had before, and it's most likely borrowed from the Norse, this idea of land ownership. Also the idea of pastoralism. The Norse were very big on their cattle, as I talked about in my video on cattle in Greenland, and so this might be an idea the Sami got from the Norse, that they were emanating that in a way by having herds of reindeer, because of course cattle wouldn't survive very long up there in the north. But it's also worth noting that this wasn't a uniform change for all the Sami people. Different regions were affected in different ways, and we only see this kind of large-scale reindeer herding and private ownership appearing in the northern parts of Finnmark in the 17th century, which is centuries after it had occurred in places further to the south that were more integrated and in contact with other peoples. So that's basically what I wrote about in my essay, but with quite a few sort of diversions and tangents that are there. I'm not sure if I can post it yet, but considering the exams aren't actually being sort of graded properly this year due to the situation, I think that should be okay. There are a few things I didn't actually get around to writing about, but I did make notes about and were fairly interesting, so I'll sort of summarize them here. Now, one is more of a DNA kind of point, and this was that actually really quite far south, I think it's sort of southwest of Uppsala, in Sweden, there was a boat burial where the individuals buried, the men buried there, had really high rates of selenium. And selenium you can only really get from eating reindeer meat. And of course, Uppsala, that's very, very much further south than where you find reindeer. So it's possible that these people were Sami individuals or had been to the north. I'm not too sure. I tried to find this study. It was mentioned in one of my ASNAC lectures, but I'm not sure exactly which study this was. If you know which one it was, please let me know in the comments below, and I can investigate it further. But I thought that was also an interesting one. But I didn't include that because I didn't have the proper context there. So it would be a bit weird to say, well, a random study found this, but I'm not sure where or who or what the context was. But that's interesting. And a whole section I actually didn't get to write about because I had a word limit that I absolutely didn't stick to. I wrote 200 more words because, come on, they gave us 24 hours. I absolutely sweated this so they can read 200 more words. It's a study by Bergman and Edlund from 2016, and it looks at the Birkalar, which I mentioned right at the start of the video. And these are a kind of group that were meant to go between the Sámi and the Swedish king. So these were, as the Norwegian king had put a ban on, so the Swedish king did something similar, and he created this group. It's the king Magnus Eriksson in 1328. He created this group, but his son actually corroborated what privileges they had in terms of trading in 1358, and he mentioned that this was generations old. So it's possible that this had been a kind of institution that had been in the Viking Age as well, that there were people who kind of lived between both worlds, who would trade with the Sámi, and were also kind of agents to the Sámi, for the Sámi, and kind of acted between the royal power of the king, in this case the Swedish king, and the Sámi groups. Now, what I found as well from this is that actually at sacrificial sites in the interior of northern Sweden, the study done from 800 to 1300, the coins are found from many, many different places. And again, these coins, metal was something that was precious to them. It shows what kind of trading connections they had. Now, these were coins that came from Denmark, Germany, Norway, England, and even from the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, of course, the Sámi weren't trekking to Arabia. That's not what I'm trying to suggest here. This was indirect trade. But it shows the kind of trading connections that were had and how objects from across the world can make it to really far-flung places. And again, that they were actually more connected to global systems than we perhaps maybe think, because of, when we think of early medieval nomadic people in the north of Scandinavia. Also, from looking at taxation records, we found that the Birkarlar were reindeer herders, and that they were some of the wealthiest reindeer herders, that maybe they had a special societal position. But what's also interesting is that according to the same records, Birkarlar are just counted as normal rural traders. So not kind of a really special position in the hierarchy, but they were people chosen from a certain substratum. They speak the Sámi language. I mean, they have to. Often they take Sámi wives, which the Swedish administration looks to in horror and then tries to besmirch them in the 16th century. Now, what's interesting is that there was clearly trade between sort of local peasants and the Sámi and the Birkalar, and this is that what would the peasants be trading? Well, they would trade their surplus crops, as they did in the Middle Ages, as well as butter and stock, while the Birkalar would be trading much higher class items. So there's evidence for a kind of bulk trade of common goods, low value, high number, high stock, whereas the Birkalar were trading in sort of low stock, high value items with the Sámi. So it suggests there's two levels of trade between the Sámi, that it's not just really basic items in that way. And that's interesting because the Birkalar, they were trading foreign goods to them, like copper vessels, iron kettles, and frieze fabrics, which again, it's interesting that it's the metal that they prized the most. And as well, we have weights and balances that were found in Sámi contexts from the Viking Age. The Vikings at the time, as I said earlier on in the Viking Age, they weren't part of the kind of monetary economy, so the coin wasn't valuable. It was the metal in the coin that was valuable to them, and it depended on weight. And for that reason, you have weights and balances, because then you can see if a coin actually has the right amount of a certain metal in it, if it matches it. But also because they were using bullion, so bits, hack silver is the term that's most often used. So again, any piece of silver, any scrap was useful because of the metal content it had, and then you'd use weights and balances to determine how valuable that was. And also in 1559, we know the Sámi were literate and aware of legal practices and judicial practices in Sweden, because they wrote a letter to the Swedish king complaining that the Birkalar were making them pay a higher price for goods than they were paying in Norway. So they clearly weren't stupid either. They were aware of these systems, they were engaging in them, but they were also in the far north. So I think that's all I have to say about this topic for now. There are also other avenues that you could look down by taking a closer look at the saga traditions, for example, because there's various accounts and stories, particularly focusing on the magical aspect of the Sami there, as well as looking at later sources like the taxation records and customs registers and things like this. But I tried to get a bit of a balance in here to look at both the earlier Viking Age textual sources and the Icelandic sagas, as well as some DNA evidence, which is sort of a more personable approach in a way, and some of the archaeology of what we actually find in Sami contexts and Sami objects in other contexts, and how this can explain who they were networked with, who they were connecting with in this way. So let me know what you think of the video format. It's looking like it's going to be a long video, but maybe that's kind of what I was aiming at, and just exploring what kind of things I was writing about in this essay about the Sami, because hopefully that means you find it interesting. And I guess because it's not being counted this year for my university exams, I think in a way part of me thinks it's a shame that it doesn't serve a greater purpose. But hopefully people have found this interesting. Please do let me know in the comment section below if you like this. Share it around with other people that would find it interesting. And share any of your own knowledge in the comments below. If there's any Sami people, then that would be awesome. Let me know if you're there, what the pronunciation was like, how to improve the pronunciation for further videos if I look into it again, and any other kind of aspects you'd like to see. I'm thinking of I might actually put a poll in at somewhere of doing the next one on another question I wrote about. So I did a question on the walrus ivory trade, as well as what sort of glass beads in West Africa can tell us about their global connection. So very different topic, that last one, but it might be something looking into. I was also potentially thinking about doing a video on where the Anglo-Saxons learned to write, because of course they come in as Germanic invaders, and within several hundred years they're writing beautiful manuscripts, and it's like, well, what the hell happened? But yeah, let me know which you prefer. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and thank you so much for tuning in to the History with Hilbert podcast. I will see you all soon. On Chien.